In the fall of 1897, a strange stillness settled over the remote hollows of Appalachia, pressing down on the narrow valley known locally as Widow's Gap. The settlement lay hidden between two steep ridges, its few homesteads scattered along a rocky passage shaped by both geology and hardship. The gap had earned its name decades earlier, after a succession of women were left alone by mining accidents, logging mishaps, and the unforgiving realities of frontier life. Over time, the name came to feel less like coincidence and more like a warning. At the center of this isolated hollow stood a two-story wooden house, perched on a stone shelf halfway up the eastern slope. From a distance, the structure appeared to cling to the mountainside, its dark boards blending into the shadows of towering hemlocks. The house had been built in 1873 by Cornelius Hawthorne, a prosperous timber merchant whose wealth was evident in every detail. Unlike the rough cabins nearby, the house featured milled lumber, glass windows with decorative frames, and a wraparound porch supported by turned columns. Even its foundation was unusual. The basement had been cut deep into the living rock, extending far beyond what was typical for rural homes of the period. Workers who helped construct the house later recalled that Hawthorne had made odd requests. He insisted on multiple cellar levels, reinforced stonework, and storage spaces that seemed excessive for a family dwelling. At the time, these choices were dismissed as eccentricities of a wealthy man unused to limitation. No one questioned them further. When Cornelius Hawthorne was killed in a sawmill accident in 1895, ownership of the property passed to his widow, Cordelia. At 43, she became the sole occupant of the house. The nearest neighbor lived nearly 2 miles away, reachable only by a narrow mountain path that became impassable during winter. Records from the county courthouse show that Cordelia maintained the property through a modest inheritance and by selling ginseng and mountain herbs to traveling merchants. Cordelia Hawthorne was something of an enigma to the local community. She had arrived in Braxton County in 1881, claiming to be the widow of a physician who had died during a yellow fever outbreak in New Orleans. Her manner and speech suggested formal education, setting her apart from most frontier women. She lived quietly, kept to herself, and maintained a sizable personal library that included medical texts and scientific journals, an unusual collection for a woman who claimed only an interest in herbal remedies. Those who encountered her described her as reserved and severe, rarely engaging in conversation. She attended church sporadically, always choosing a seat at the back and leaving immediately after the final hymn. Over time, these appearances grew more unsettling. According to a minister's private notes, Cordelia's health appeared to decline after her husband's death. She grew noticeably thinner, her complexion pale, her gaze increasingly intense. During services, she was observed staring fixedly at members of the congregation, studying them with an attention that felt intrusive and deliberate. Offers of assistance were politely but firmly dismissed. When asked about her well-being or the work that occupied her time, she responded only with a thin smile before turning away. After that, she stopped lingering at all. As the months passed, Cordelia's isolation deepened. The timber crews that once visited the house no longer came. Logging operations shifted to more accessible terrain, and her husband's former business partner ceased his visits entirely. By the winter of 1896, her only regular human contact came from a monthly delivery route that serviced the scattered homesteads of the region. The circuit rider who visited Widow's Gap kept careful records as part of his duties, noting supply requests and payments with meticulous detail. At first, Cordelia's entries were unremarkable. Over time, however, subtle changes began to appear. Her requests grew more specific, her manner more guarded. She stopped inviting visitors inside, choosing instead to conduct exchanges at the gate. When asked about her health, she made a single unsettling remark that the walls had grown thin and she could hear too much. By early 1897, faint rumors began to circulate among the remaining families of the hollow. Some spoke of strange smells drifting from the mountainside near the Hawthorne house, sharp and chemical, mixed with something harder to identify. Others mentioned that Cordelia was rarely seen during daylight hours anymore. Her chimney, however, was often acted before dawn. Widow's Gap had always been a place where sounds behaved strangely. Even small noises could echo and linger, amplified by the narrow valley while remaining hidden from the outside world. In that stillness, people began to listen more closely, and what they thought they heard would soon become impossible to ignore. By the early months of 1897, the quiet of Widow's Gap had taken on a different quality. What had once been simple isolation began to feel watchful, as though the land itself were holding its breath. Neighbors who had lived in the hollow for decades remarked that the valley no longer settled into silence at night. Instead, it carried sound in unnatural ways, drawing attention to disturbances that could not easily be explained. The sound reminded them of heavy tools meeting stone or wood, steady and methodical, continuing for hours without pause. At first, they assumed roadwork or repairs, but there were no crews in the area and no reason for such labor at that hour. Others began to notice the smoke. It did not rise solely from the chimney of the Hawthorne house, but from points along the slope where no outbuildings were known to exist. The smoke appeared most often in the early morning, thin and pale, dissipating quickly among the trees. During daylight hours, nothing unusual could be seen. No fresh clearings, no stacked timber, no sign that work of any kind had been done. Animals reacted before people did. Hunting dogs refused to approach the Hawthorne property, whining and pulling against their leads. Livestock grew restless on nights when the sounds carried farthest through the gap. These reactions were noted, remembered, and quietly set aside, as such things often were in remote places where explanations were scarce. The circuit rider's records from this period show a clear shift in tone. His entries, once practical and unemotional, began to include observations that bordered on concern. He noted that Cordelia Hawthorne no longer accepted deliveries inside the house. She stood at the gate listening intently while he spoke, her attention often drifting toward the forest behind him. Her appearance suggested prolonged exhaustion. Dark circles beneath her eyes, hands that trembled slightly as she counted out payment. Her supply requests changed as well. Orders began to include quantities of chemical compounds used in preservation and disinfection, along with medical instruments that had no obvious use in herbal practice. When questioned, Cordelia explained that she was conducting research into natural preservation methods. Her tone was calm, almost rehearsed, and she discouraged further discussion. What unsettled the circuit rider most was the smell. It clung to the ground around the house, strongest near the foundation. Sharp, clinical, and unmistakably artificial, it reminded him of hospitals he had seen during earlier travels. Mixed with it was an organic undertone that made his stomach turn. He recorded these observations carefully, unsure of their significance but unwilling to ignore them. As spring approached, the sounds became more frequent. A man who operated a small grist mill in the lower reaches of the gap reported hearing the striking noises as early as 3 in the morning. From his vantage point, he could see the Hawthorne property in partial silhouette. He described lights moving through the forest along paths that were invisible by day. These lights did not wander or flicker like lanterns carried by travelers. They moved in deliberate patterns, appearing and disappearing with purpose. On several nights, he counted multiple light sources at once. When he attempted to investigate, approaching quietly through the trees, the activity ceased abruptly. The lights vanished. The sounds stopped. He found no evidence of recent work, no disturbed earth, no footprints. Standing in the clearing where moments earlier there had been unmistakable signs of movement, he felt an overwhelming sensation of being observed. Though he saw nothing, the certainty of unseen attention drove him away. Local folklore began to resurface in conversations that followed. Widow's Gap, it was said, had always been a place where the land listened. Stories passed down through generations spoke of echoes that returned words spoken in anger and of hidden chambers beneath the ridges. Such tales had long been treated as superstition. Now, they took on a different weight. Geologically, the gap was known to rest on limestone riddled with natural caverns. Old surveys mentioned cave systems extending far beyond what had been fully explored. In earlier times, these formations had been used for storage and shelter. Some were rumored to have been modified long before European settlement, though no clear purpose had ever been established. Few living residents knew much about these reports, but the idea of hollow ground beneath the valley was not new. What was new was the growing sense that something beneath Widow's Gap was active. By midsummer, the circuit rider noted that Cordelia Hawthorne's orders had become almost exclusively specialized. Surgical tools, preserving agents, volumes of anatomical study. Each request was paid for promptly, in cash, without negotiation. When asked if she required assistance, she responded with visible irritation. She said only that the work demanded precision and that interruptions were dangerous. He wrote that during one visit, she mentioned hearing voices through the walls, not as hallucinations, but as vibrations carried through the stone. She spoke of pressure, of the mountain shifting, of structures settling into place. Her words were delivered calmly, but her eyes betrayed an intensity that left him shaken. As summer gave way to fall, no one in Widow's Gap could say exactly when concern turned into fear. There was no single incident, no clear line, only the growing realization that the sounds, the smells, the lights, and the secrecy were not diminishing. They were becoming more organized, and whatever was taking shape beneath the Hawthorne property was nearing completion. The first unmistakable sign that something was wrong came in early November of 1897. When the circuit rider arrived at Widow's Gap for his monthly delivery, he found the Hawthorne property silent in a way it had never been before. No smoke rose from the chimney. No movement stirred among the trees. Even the usual sounds of the forest seemed muted as he made his way up the narrow path to the house. He called out for Cordelia Hawthorne as he approached the front porch. There was no reply. The front door stood slightly ajar, an odd and troubling detail for a woman who had grown increasingly cautious over the previous year. After several more unanswered calls, he stepped inside. The interior of the house showed no signs of struggle. Furniture was undisturbed. Personal belongings were neatly arranged, as if Cordelia had simply stepped away for a moment. On the kitchen table sat a purse containing a significant amount of money, left openly in view. In the dining area, a partially eaten meal remained on a plate, utensils set down as though the diner had been interrupted mid-bite. The food showed signs of having been left for days, yet decomposition was minimal, the cool mountain air preserving it longer than expected. What unsettled the circuit rider most was the implication of sudden absence. There were no packed bags, no missing clothing, nothing to suggest a planned departure. Whatever had taken Cordelia from the table had done so without warning. As he moved through the house, a familiar odor grew stronger. The sharp, chemical scent that had lingered outside now filled the interior. Tracing it downward, he descended into the cellar. There, he discovered something that erased any remaining doubt that this was more than a simple disappearance. The cellar floor had been disturbed over a wide area. Earth had been removed and replaced with deliberate care, packed down in clean geometric sections. This was not the haphazard digging of a root cellar expansion or foundation repair. The excavations followed a precise pattern, forming connections that extended beyond the footprint of the house itself. The scale of the work suggested planning, time, and skill well beyond what one person should have been capable of alone. Uneasy and unsure of how to proceed, the circuit rider reported his findings to the county sheriff. The official response was slow. Widow's Gap lay far from the main roads, and winter was approaching. When the sheriff and two deputies finally arrived days later, their investigation confirmed the initial observations. Cordelia Hawthorne was gone. Her possessions remained. The cellar had been altered extensively, revealing the beginnings of a subterranean network that connected to natural stone formations beneath the house. Despite the unsettling nature of the discovery, the sheriff's report remained cautious. There was no direct evidence of violence, no body, no clear indication of foul play. In an era with limited resources and vast territories to cover, the case was classified as a missing persons investigation. Further complicating matters was the condition of the house's fireplace. Within it, deputies found the charred remains of documents that had been deliberately burned. Though the papers were too damaged to reconstruct, their quantity and careful destruction suggested intent rather than accident. The sheriff noted that the act appeared premeditated, though the reason remained unclear. Questioned under oath, the circuit rider described the changes he had observed over the past year, the specialized supplies, the strange smells, Cordelia's guarded behavior. He admitted that the cellar's condition could not be explained by casual labor or recent work. Whatever excavation had taken place had been ongoing for some time. The sheriff's office conducted a brief search of the surrounding area, but found nothing beyond the property itself. Trails vanished into dense forest. Limestone outcroppings and natural caves made the terrain treacherous and difficult to search thoroughly. With winter weather closing in and pressure from county officials to limit expenses, the investigation stalled. Officially, there was no crime. Unofficially, concern spread quickly through Widow's Gap. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about what the cellar might connect to, about the lights seen at night and the sounds that had carried through the valley. Some believed Cordelia had fled, abandoning her home and whatever work she had been engaged in. Others feared she had fallen victim to an accident within the very tunnels she had been excavating. A few suggested darker possibilities, but lacked the evidence to voice them openly. As days turned into weeks with no sign of Cordelia Hawthorne, attention began to drift elsewhere. The case was quietly deprioritized, folded into a growing stack of unresolved rural disappearances. Yet the altered cellar remained, sealed but not forgotten, a silent testament to work left unfinished. Winter descended on Widow's Gap, covering paths and entrances with snow and ice. Whatever lay beneath the Hawthorne house was hidden once more, and for a time, it seemed as though the valley itself had decided to keep its secrets. Quiet burial of the Hawthorne case might have endured indefinitely, if not for a chance discovery made the following spring. In April of 1898, a ginseng harvester working the upper slopes of Widow's Gap noticed an irregular depression in the forest floor roughly half a mile northwest of the abandoned house. The ground had sunk inward, forming a shallow basin that did not match any natural erosion patterns common to the area. The harvester was a man who knew the terrain intimately. Decades of seasonal foraging had made him sensitive to even subtle changes in the landscape. He was certain the depression had not been there the previous year. Its edges were too clean, its shape too deliberate. When he probed the soil with a walking staff, the ground yielded with unnatural ease. Local authorities were notified, and within weeks the site became the focus of a renewed investigation, this time under the supervision of a state detective brought in from the capital. Unlike the county officials before him, the detective arrived with specialized equipment and a mandate to pursue the matter fully. Excavation began cautiously. What initially appeared to be a simple collapse soon revealed itself as something far more deliberate. Beneath the settled earth lay the remnants of a concealed structure, an underground complex that had been intentionally buried. As the dig progressed, chambers carved directly into bedrock were uncovered, connected by narrow tunnels that extended in multiple directions. The workmanship was precise. Ventilation shafts had been carefully engineered. Drainage channels diverted groundwater away from the interior spaces. This was not a crude hiding place, it was a functional facility. Within the chambers, investigators found the remains of wooden work tables, their surfaces preserved by the stable underground conditions. Broken glassware lay scattered nearby, some pieces still bearing residue. Rusted tools were recovered, many of them recognizable as surgical instruments. Chemical containers, long since emptied, were stacked neatly along one wall. The organic materials were what disturbed the investigators most. Bone fragments were found embedded in the soil and stored in small groupings, too fragmented to allow for immediate identification, but unmistakably human. Alongside them were scraps of fabric, buttons, and leather, remnants of clothing that suggested the presence of multiple individuals over time. Laboratory analysis confirmed what the site itself implied. Clean-cut marks indicated the use of sharp instruments rather than animal activity. Some fragments bore traces of chemical treatment consistent with preservation methods used in anatomical study. Soil samples revealed elevated concentrations of acids, preservatives, and metallic compounds, indicating prolonged and repeated use of the space. The implications were unavoidable. The underground facility had not been the result of a single event or a moment of desperation. It had been used systematically, over an extended period, by someone with both technical knowledge and sustained access to specialized materials. When artifacts recovered from the site were shown to the circuit rider, his reaction was immediate. He identified several items as supplies he had personally delivered to the Hawthorne property over the preceding months. His delivery records, once mundane, now formed a clear timeline of escalating preparation. Chemicals ordered in increasing quantities, instruments acquired in careful sequence, texts requested that corresponded directly with the methods suggested by the evidence. Under questioning, he admitted that he had suspected nothing beyond eccentricity. Cordelia Hawthorne had been polite, efficient, and prompt in payment. Isolation, he reasoned, explained her oddities. In hindsight, those assumptions weighed heavily on him. Further examination of the buried chambers uncovered fragments of journals. The pages were badly damaged by moisture and time, but portions remained legible. Handwriting analysis confirmed what investigators already feared. The notes belonged to Cordelia Hawthorne. The fragments detailed anatomical observations, experimental procedures, and repeated references to what she described as optimization. The language was clinical, precise, and devoid of emotion. Subjects were reduced to variables. Processes were described as iterative, requiring multiple trials to refine technique. There was no indication of consent, no acknowledgement of moral consideration. Most disturbing were passages that spoke of preparation and transformation, of the necessity to understand the vessel before alteration could be completed. The tone suggested not madness, but conviction. As the scope of the investigation widened, another troubling question emerged. None of the surrounding communities had reported missing persons that could account for the remains. The victims, it seemed, were individuals whose absence had gone unnoticed. The answer came from an unexpected source. A traveling merchant came forward with information about men he had encountered over the previous 2 years. Solitary travelers, drifters seeking work or shelter. He admitted that he had often directed such men toward Widow's Gap, believing that isolated homesteads might offer temporary labor in exchange for food and lodging. He recognized descriptions of clothing and personal effects recovered from the site. They were men no one would miss, he said quietly. Men who moved from place to place, leaving little trace behind. With this revelation, the pattern became clear. Cordelia Hawthorne had not relied on chance. She had cultivated opportunity. Her isolation had been a tool, her reputation a disguise. The underground facility was not merely a workspace, but the culmination of months, perhaps years of planning. As investigators compiled their findings, the narrative shifted irrevocably. This was no longer a case of a vanished widow or even a hidden crime scene. It was evidence of sustained, methodical experimentation carried out beyond the reach of oversight or accountability. Yet one question remained unanswered. If Cordelia Hawthorne had built this place, used it, and buried it, where was she now? The question of Cordelia Hawthorne's fate lingered long after the underground laboratory had been exposed. Investigators scoured the surrounding forest, revisited the tunnels beneath the house, and expanded their searches outward from Widow's Gap. Still, no trace of her was found. As spring turned to summer, the absence of a body threatened to fracture the case, leaving it suspended between revelation and uncertainty. The answer emerged nearly a year to the day after her disappearance. In November of 1898, a hunting party ventured into the deeper reaches of Widow's Gap, well beyond the paths most locals avoided. There, tucked into a limestone outcropping 3/4 of a mile from the Hawthorne property, they found evidence of a collapse. The entrance to a natural cave had been deliberately sealed, its mouth choked with rubble that bore unmistakable signs of human intervention. State authorities were notified immediately. When excavation began, it became clear that the collapse had not been accidental. Support points within the cave had been compromised with precision, triggering a controlled cave-in designed to entomb whatever lay beyond. What lay beneath surpassed even the grim discoveries made earlier that year. The cave system extended far beyond a natural formation. Its walls had been cut, reinforced, and expanded into a complex that rivaled professional research facilities of the era. Multiple chambers branched off from a central passage, each serving a distinct function. Living quarters showed evidence of long-term habitation. Storage areas contained preserved supplies. Waste disposal systems had been carefully engineered to prevent surface contamination. This was not a place meant for brief use, it was designed for endurance. Within the deepest chamber, recovery teams found skeletal remains. Analysis confirmed that they belonged to Cordelia Hawthorne. Her identity was established through dental records and comparison with documents preserved at the county courthouse. Yet it was the condition of her remains that drew immediate attention. Her skeleton bore extensive evidence of surgical modification. Bones had been cut, repositioned, and fused in ways that defied anatomical norms. The precision of the alterations suggested advanced knowledge and deliberate intent. These were not injuries inflicted by collapse or decay. They were the result of planned procedures carried out over time. Medical examination concluded that Cordelia had subjected herself to the same experimental processes described in her journals. Early modifications appeared cautious, exploratory. Later changes were increasingly extreme, compromising structural integrity and vital function. Ultimately, they proved fatal. Among the debris recovered from the cave were additional journal entries, damaged but partially legible. These final notes revealed the culmination of her work. Cordelia wrote of nearing completion, of the necessity for the experimenter to become the subject. She acknowledged the cost of the process, both in materials and in lives, but expressed unwavering belief in the outcome. If the principles were sound, she wrote, transformation would occur. If they were not, the proof of failure would remain hidden. Investigators concluded that Cordelia had deliberately sealed the cave from within, collapsing the entrance to erase her work and ensure that the final phase of her experiment remained undisturbed. Whether she expected to survive the transformation or accepted death as an acceptable result remained unclear. The case was officially closed in December of 1898. Authorities ruled that Cordelia Hawthorne was both perpetrator and victim, responsible for acts described in sealed records as crimes against nature and human dignity. The full findings were withheld from the public. Local residents were told only that she had died in an accidental cave-in and that the property would be reclaimed for unpaid taxes. The decision to suppress the details was framed as a matter of public interest. County leaders feared that disclosure would stain the region's reputation and deter economic development in an area already struggling with isolation and limited opportunity. Records were sealed indefinitely. Widow's Gap returned to quiet. The Hawthorne house stood empty, its dark silhouette unchanged. For a time, it seemed as though the valley had finally released its secrets, burying them alongside the woman who had carved herself into the mountain. But silence in Widow's Gap had never meant absence. For several years after the investigation was closed, the Hawthorne property remained untouched. The house deteriorated quickly without maintenance. Roof shingles slipped, windows shattered, and the forest began reclaiming the cleared ground. Those who passed nearby reported an unease they could not explain, a sense that the land resisted attention. In 1903, a mining company purchased the property, drawn by geological surveys that suggested coal deposits beneath the ridges surrounding Widow's Gap. Plans to use the house as quarters for survey crews were abandoned within months. Workers reported discovering bone fragments during routine digging, along with metal instruments that appeared recently cleaned despite decades of abandonment. Several men refused to continue working after encountering what they described as preserved human tissue buried at shallow depths. Operations ceased quietly. A similar attempt by a timber company in 1997 ended even more abruptly. Logging crews uncovered additional remains scattered across a far wider area than previously documented. Company records described soil that appeared chemically altered, resistant to normal decay, and saturated with substances inconsistent with natural processes. The foreman's final report stated simply that the land was no longer fit for human use. By 1908, the property was abandoned permanently. Decades passed. Widow's Gap faded from official memory, its name surviving only in local warnings and half-remembered stories. Yet the physical legacy of Cordelia Hawthorne's work endured beneath the surface. A state geological survey conducted in 1969 revealed widespread soil contamination across several acres. Chemical signatures indicated long-term disposal of processed organic matter. Subsurface scans detected extensive tunnel systems linking natural caverns to hand-cut passages that extended far beyond the original house site. The survey was halted without explanation. The final report classified the area as unsuitable for development or public access, citing geological instability and environmental hazard. The land was designated protected forest, and entry was restricted. Interest in the case resurfaced briefly during the early 1960s, when a university criminologist began reviewing sealed archival materials. His research uncovered references to missing reports, altered records, and oral histories describing additional burial sites throughout the gap. After a solitary visit to the area, he suffered a psychological collapse and abandoned his work entirely. When his sealed files were opened decades later, they contained little more than publicly available documents. His original notes were gone. Despite restrictions, unauthorized visitors continued to enter Widow's Gap. Between 1970 and 1975, several hikers became lost under circumstances that defied easy explanation. All were found disoriented, reporting altered landmarks and structures that could not be verified. In 1974, a group of explorers attempting to document the remains of the Hawthorne house vanished for 4 days. When recovered, they exhibited severe psychological trauma. Their photographs showed no ruins, only forest, but some images contained unexplained geometric distortions burned into the film. Official investigations attributed these incidents to stress, exposure, and suggestion. Yet the consistency of the reports troubled those familiar with the case. The area remains closed. Modern analysis suggests that Cordelia Hawthorne's activities were enabled by isolation, planning, and the invisibility of her victims. But the most unsettling implication lies elsewhere. Evidence gathered across decades indicates that her work may not have been entirely solitary. References in recovered notes to shared methodologies and distant correspondence hint at broader networks that were never identified. Much of what could confirm or refute these possibilities has been destroyed, buried, or sealed beyond reach. Widow's Gap still exists, hidden beneath dense forest and official silence. The ground there bears the chemical scars of deliberate acts carried out over many years. What lies beneath it remains only partially mapped. And though no sanctioned work continues there, reports persist of sounds that carry too far through the valley, of hollow echoes where none should exist. Some places, it seems, do not forget what was done within them.